Okay, thank you. All right, so we're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 18. Starting with verse 1, it says, "And David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over him." So this tells us that there was a pretty good, large number of people that were with David, right? If he's got captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, he's got a pretty good number of men that are with him. So he sets 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, who is his commander, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, that's Joab's brother, and then 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. I don't know if you remember him. He was a chapter or two ago. He's one of the Philistines. Isn't that amazing? He was one of them. He must have been very trusted that David would then put him in charge of 1/3 of the army. And the king said to the people, "I also will surely go out with you myself." Isn't it amazing that David seems to have learned the lesson of you don't want to stay home when your army's out? Because then you have too much time on your hands and you get to peeping around and things happen to you. Right? We talked about that with the Bathsheba thing. So whether or not that's the reason, regardless of what's going on, David now says, "I will go with you myself." But the people have a different thought. The people answered and said, "You shall not go with us, for if we flee away, they won't care about us. Or if half of us die, will they care about us? But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in the city." All right, so this group of people that are with him are thoroughly dedicated, right? So they said, "We can all go out and die, and it's no big deal, but David, we can't lose you."
And what city is this?
This would be Jerusalem. And so if, regardless of what's going on, if there's to be any hope of not falling into the hands of Absalom, which realistically all of these people who are following David, if they fell into the hands of Absalom, they would all be killed. So if there's any hope at all in stopping that from happening, they're going to need to make sure that David is safe and protected and in no danger. And the king said to them, "Whatever seems best to you, I will do." I don't know how to take that, honestly. I'm not 100% sure. You could look at it a couple of different ways. It's a good way not to have to go out into the battle. I don't know. It's also, David may have learned to take advice well. He may be heeding good advice. There are a lot of different ways that you could look at that. But in whatever way he meant it, he took the advice of the people and says, "If you think that's the best thing, then I will stay here."
Sounds like he doubts his own leadership now.
Could be that. That's a possibility also. Did you have something?
About how old is he now?
David would be, let me stop for just a minute, 50s, late 50s, early 60s, something like that. So the king says, oh, there he is. "And so the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands." So basically what happens in that one is that he's just giving them their blessing as they parade and go by. He's basically standing there and giving them the blessing. Now, verse 5. "Now the king had commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Deal gently, for my sake, with the young man Absalom.' And all of the people heard when the king gave all of the captains orders concerning Absalom." All right, stop just a minute. And who is he telling? He's telling Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. And what is he telling them?
Don't kill my son.
Don't kill him. Bring him back to me. Don't kill my son. And that little note is in here for us when it says, "And all of the people heard it." So there are witnesses to everything that David is saying. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel. So when they say against Israel, it sounds confusing, doesn't it? Because this is Israel, and they're going out against Israel. But keep in mind that this is the 10 tribes that we talked about earlier. "And they went into the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim." So that would be somewhere near the Bethlehem area. And so around the Jerusalem area, they're not too far away from Jerusalem at this point. And this would be the heavily wooded area of that time. So very likely David and his men would have the advantage here because they would know very well the pitfalls of the forest. If you're coming from an area that's further away and you've never been in that forest, you're a newcomer. But David and his men definitely have the advantage in that area. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside. Here's an interesting little note. And the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So of that 20,000 people, more were killed by what happened to them in the woods than were killed by the sword. So what would happen to them in the woods?
Animals.
Could be animals, pits, could be trip, break your leg. There are all kinds of dangers that would be in the woods that these people who come from outside the area are not going to know about. And it must have been quite severe to have that many people killed by the woods. That's a lot of people dying in the darkness of the woods. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Okay, that's not good. So these are the two opposite sides, right? David's men and Absalom now meet. Absalom rode on a mule. Some people try and make a big deal of that. Well, that's not very kingly, but actually that would have been the very common thing for him to have done. That would have likely been what he would have ridden. It doesn't really mean anything. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree. So a terebinth tree would be the easiest thing for us to liken it to would be one of our oaks, actually. Very similar to an oak tree. And there were many of them evidently in this forest. It was very heavily wooded with them. So his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth. And the mule, which was under him, went on. All right, so Absalom gets caught in the boughs of the branches of this oak tree. Interesting, where does it say that Absalom got caught? His head got caught. From the time of Josephus on, first century, Josephus, the teaching was that it was his hair, that he was tangled up with his hair. That's probably the story you've heard. That isn't really what the scripture says. The scripture said it was his head. Where that comes from is the fact that earlier, remember we had great detail about his hair? His hair would be considered part of his head. And so we had all that detail about he had 5 pounds of hair cut off every year because he had such heavy hair. So Josephus believes that it would have been a tangling of his hair in the terebinth tree, and that is 99 times out of 100 you will hear people say Absalom's hair was tangled up. Scripturally, it says his head was caught in the boughs of the tree. When I was looking for a picture for the front of your packet this week, I spent a lot of time looking for a head caught in the tree because all of the pictures are Absalom's hair all tangled up in there. It's just one of those little details that you just want to remember. These are the type of things that oftentimes become fact because we hear them repeated so often. Again, hair is part of the head. And so I'm not saying there isn't a possibility that his hair, 5 pounds of hair, couldn't have got all mingled up in there. I'm simply saying someone took a little liberty and said it was his hair, and didn't use the term head, and that becomes the teaching and the story. So just...
But how would your hair kill you? I mean,
well,
it
got stuck.
I know, but I mean,
the hair
likely
doesn't...
you would hang if you got your head.
But the hair doesn't kill him. Even the hanging by by his head doesn't kill him. So it just keeps him contained.
Okay.
So either one of those could have done it. So anyway, just note there that I took a lot of time trying to find him stuck with his head in the oak tree.
And you did well.
And he is handsome.
And there he is. And so and then the little detail, and the mule went out from underneath him. Well, that's kind of what hanging is that the bottom goes out from under you.
They used to hang people like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Even in the 1800s.
Now, a certain man, I'm in verse 10. Now, a certain man saw it and told Joab, okay, look in verse 5, one of the 3 men that was put in charge, and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? And why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. All right. So, this guy sees Absalom hanging. He doesn't do anything to Absalom. He goes to Joab and he says, hey, I saw Absalom hanging in the tree. Now, based on what David has told them, Joab and Abishai and Ittai, what do you think would have been, what should they have done?
And help them
They should have just
Okay. Captured him, cut him out of the tree, captured him, and took him based on what David had told them, right? So that would be the thinking of this man who sees him hanging in the tree and goes to Joab. And Joab says, why did you not strike him to the ground? Why did you not kill him? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. So the belt at this point is the military belt that you would have worn as you go up the ranks, your belt, sort of like, kung fu, or not kung fu, judo or karate. The different color belts that you get as you go up in karate. Okay, something similar like that. As you go up in the ranks of the military, you would be given a belt. So what he's really telling him here is you would have gotten a promotion out of that. You would have gone up to the next. We would have promoted you, plus you could have gotten a reward for what it is that you did. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Well, that's not word for word what he said, but it's the meaning, right? And so this guy's saying, we all heard it. We all heard it. 13, otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. So he said, how would I have even gotten away with that? The king would have found out, I would have been punished, and you yourself would have come after me because you were the one that was given the instruction not to harm him. So why would I do that, even for 1,000 shekels of silver? And Joab said, I can't linger with you. I can't deal with you anymore. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. All right. So, the hand used for, the word used for spears is actually something more like a hand thing, like a dart, a dagger, a small item. It was personal. He didn't have a long spear that he threw at him from a distance. He went up to him personally and put the 3 daggers in his heart. Why do you suppose Joab would do that given the instructions that David had given him?
I know that David, if he had gotten Absalom back, it would have just continued because he just never dealt with those kind of problems with his sons. And Joab knew that too.
Okay. So if that's the case, and if he knows that David is not going to deal with Absalom, and so bringing Absalom back just perpetuates the whole problem, the division of the tribes and the issue between David and Absalom. just a chapter ago, David was fleeing Jerusalem, trying to get away from Absalom. Whose interest is Joab looking after?
Better to have Joab do it than to have David do it. Then David wouldn't have to feel guilty about punishment.
Well, I don't think that David ever would have done it,
No, he wouldn't have.
is the point. But what I'm trying to get into the mindset of Joab through this.
If Absalom ends up king, then Joab's gone.
Okay? Okay, so self-preservation, part of it.
And Absalom had already put Amasa in Joab's place.
For his army.
With his army.
Okay, okay.
Well, if he spared him, that doesn't mean that Absalom's going to change his mind. He's still going to try to kill David if he wants to be the king.
So Joab is also looking after David's interest in his own mind. So is Joab correct in let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He recognizes all those things that we just talked about. Is he correct in going over and killing Absalom? As far as saving David.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, maybe, right? Maybe it's not a bad plan if you're thinking about what's best for David.
How about
But is he right
no?
in what he did?
Does follow the building not?
So there's two ways of looking at that, right? He could be correct in that perhaps it was the best thing for David. Perhaps it was the best thing for Israel. Perhaps. And so you give him some benefit of the doubt there. But was he right when David had specifically said, bring Absalom home to me. Deal gently with my son.
No, I disobeyed the king.
He disobeyed the king, didn't he? Now we're going to see Joab's a pretty cheeky guy. He's a pretty cheeky guy. He's got a lot of, bravery behind him. He's willing to stand up to David in many ways. But killing David's son sort of crosses that line, doesn't it?
Right. Is Joab the nephew of David?
Yes, he is. And he's the one who's been with David since the beginning. He's cousins to Absalom. But the loyalty goes beyond blood and family. It goes, to the nation and all that's going on there, along with self-preservation on the same way that Ahithophel hangs himself so that he doesn't fall under David's justice. So too, Joab doesn't want Absalom in there for obvious reasons. He's in big trouble. So Joab may have been correct in making that decision for the good of David, but he certainly was not right in what it was that he did, because he went against everything that the king had for him. I'm going to just throw it out there for future, we're going to talk about it more later, but as we saw with Shemaiah, David will never forgive Joab for what he does. But Joab will continue to work with David and continue to be part of David's administration. For the long term of David's reign, Joab is in there. He's good for David's administration. David likes having him there. But at the end of his life, when David is settling the score and setting his household in order, he does not forgive or forget what Joab did to Absalom. So that's another one of those things that David carries with him for the lifetime. All right, so now verse 15. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. All right, 10 men carrying your armor, protecting you with shields and different things. This tells you Joab's a pretty important guy. He's got 10 guys surrounding him, protecting him. And those 10 guys wait until Joab does the deed. And then it says, it gives you the impression that they struck him, so they're beating him. It's, it's not necessarily, I guess they could have used, sticks or whatever, but they've struck him and they kill him there. So whether he's dead from the darts or dead from the beatings or whatever it is, he's good and dead, hanging there from the tree. Now, a lot of people like to take the fact that there were 10 young men and correlate it to the fact that Absalom took 10 concubines. I can't say. It's an interesting point. I can't tell you whether that's right or wrong, but he did defile 10 women who are going to pay a big price. We're going to see in our next chapter. They pay a big price for what Absalom did to them, and the fact that there were 10 men who finish Absalom off and kill him. So just an interesting note there. 16. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. He's finishing it off. And they took Absalom, his body at this point, and they cast him into a large pit in the very woods where they had been fighting. And they laid a very large heap of stones over him. And then all Israel fled, every one to his tent. All right, so they're not giving Absalom any glory in his death. They do not want any sort of memorial set up that the people can come and, energize themselves around. And so they take him and they do, something that would be very disgraceful to the king's son, which is they just dig a pit, they throw him in it, and they put a bunch of rocks on top of him. An unmarked grave, so to speak, in the midst of the woods that were dangerous and they would not have a lot of people come into. And when it says all Israel fled, everyone to his own tent, then as we've mentioned before, this is Absalom's people. They see what happens to Absalom. Somehow this is known, viewed, or told, and they know what's happened to Absalom, and they run. This is the 10 tribes that run. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up a pillar for himself. Oh, he thought ahead, huh? Which is in the King's Valley. That would be more than likely the Kidron Valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's Monument. All right, so Absalom, being a young man, you wouldn't think he would set up his own memorial so much, being on the younger end of it, but he takes care of it. It says because he has no son. Earlier we read that Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter. Remember, the daughter's name was Tamar, and she was beautiful, named after his sister. And the 3 sons I told you at that time, they were not named. And the reason they were not named is likely because they would have died in infancy or at a very young age. And so if they had died before the 8th day, they would have never been given a name. If they had died after the 8th day and in infancy, it just wouldn't have carried on. So to Absalom's mindset, he had no sons at this point, although earlier it had mentioned he had 3. And so he makes his own pillar, and he calls the pillar Absalom's pillar. And it's called Absalom's pillar, or monument, to this day. I included in your packet a little picture of what is known as Absalom's monument in Israel today. It's outside, not too far away from Jerusalem. It's a just a little pic like this. And did you guys not get it? I see everyone looking up. Oh, okay. Okay, good. This was likely erected many hundreds of years after Absalom. This is not likely to be anything that was there during the time we're talking about. Very likely, because what happens over there over and over and over and over again is a grandfather tells his grandson, this is where Absalom had his monument. And then the grandson tells his grandson, Grandpa told me that over there was where Absalom had his monument. Now, sometimes it works, and then something gets erected on that spot. What gets tricky is that people tend to forget where they were pointing to, and they just remember that we were standing right here when Grandpa told us that Absalom's monument was here, and so then it becomes right here. So in all over Israel, you find these things that they know for a fact are not the accurate places where they would literally be. We know biblically it would not be correct. So, but it's traditional. That's how when you go on the tours, they'll tell you, this is the traditional site of X, Y, and Z. And that's because throughout history, people have said it was over there, and it was over there, and it was here, they remember, and so they just erect it somewhere nearby. It doesn't actually have to be the literal site. We tend to like these kind of things, and so we cling to them in to have something to go to and to look at. People tend to like it, and they forget that it's not actually factual. For example, the Garden Tomb that everyone who ever goes to Israel wants to go and participate in. It's a lovely example of what an early century tomb would look like, and it says on the door, "He is not here, for he is risen." And I love to go in it and kind of get an idea of what it's like in there. But that's at the earliest a 3rd century tomb. They like to promote it as this is the tomb because of the proximity to where the crucifixion would have occurred and blah blah blah. This is the tomb. Well, it's a tomb, and it's similar to what Jesus would have gone into, and it certainly still fills you with all the emotion when you go into it, but it is not the tomb. And that's where you get into problems with some of the monument stuff, is saying, well, this is the spot. This is it. Very few places are the spot, but they represent the spot. And so Absalom's monument is a monument like that, but this would not have been there. This is not the monument that we're reading about. Did you have a question?
Interesting because underneath above that it says that kids threw rocks at it
Yes.
because of the commandment. But that's also what they did when they buried him. He was a rebellious son, and they were supposed to stone rebellious sons.
Yes. Yeah, so the piling on of the stones you're saying is an example of that. Yeah, if you get a chance, you can see this. This is, it says, rebellious children were taught in Judaism to throw stones at Yad Abshalom, the shrine of Absalom, to learn what rebellion leads to. If anyone in Jerusalem has a disobedient child, he should take him out to the valley of Jehoshaphat, to Absalom's monument, and force him, by words or stripes, to hurl stones at it and to curse Absalom, meanwhile telling him the life and the fate of that rebellious son. So it became a way to teach your children, right? There you go. This could happen to you too.
End up hanging in a tree.
Yeah. And then they go and shave their heads, so there's no hair on their heads. All right. So we finished the pillars, so now let's go to 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." So Ahimaaz was obviously the courier, the runner, and that's how messages were taken before the internet, girls. There you go. And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." So he's protecting him. Ooh, no. You can't go take this news to the king, because we don't know how the king's going to react, and this is not good news. And then in verse 21, it's kind of funny. So Joab says to the Cushite, "You go and tell the news. Go and tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab, and he ran. So a second runner. But Ahimaaz doesn't give up. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please, let me also run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "Well, why will you run, my son? Because you have no news ready." "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." Wears him down, doesn't he? So he says, "Okay, run." Then Ahimaaz ran the way of the plain, and he outruns the Cushite. So the Cushite's taking the switchbacks and this sort of thing, going the way that they probably had planned to do it, and Ahimaaz just makes the straight stop through, and he ends up beating the Cushite, even though the Cushite was given the job to relay the news, which makes it all the more humorous as to how he responds once he gets there. Let's get to that. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up from the roof over the gate to the wall, and he lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "Well, if he's alone, there's news in his mouth." And he came rapidly, and he drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "Hey, there's another man running alone." And the king says, "Oh, he also brings news." So they're recognizing what these are. These are the runners coming with the news. And Ahimaaz called out and 27. So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. It's kind of funny. And the king says, oh, he is a good man and comes with good news. So only bad men come with bad news and good men come with good news. Yeah. I think he's hoping that's what it is. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. In the Hebrew, what he actually says is shalom, peace. It's a greeting. It's more of just a, hey, we're good here, all is well. And he bows down with his face to the earth before the king, and he says, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord, the king. So what is he telling him?
You've won the battle.
Your enemies are dead. Victory has been delivered unto you. All of your enemies are dead, all the ones who went against you. The king isn't terribly concerned about that. Verse 29, the king said, is the young man Absalom safe?
Leading question.
Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I don't know what it was all about. He was awfully anxious to get to the king. He was awfully anxious to share the news. He gets in the presence of the king. He gives him the good news that victory has occurred, but he cannot bring himself to tell him that Absalom is dead. He cannot bring himself to do it, which I think, given how big of a fit he threw to get there, is just so interesting. And the king said, well, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and he stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, there's good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all of those who rose against you. That's the same news that he got. And the king said to the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? So the Cushite answers and say, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. There's his first notice that Absalom is dead. Then the king was deeply moved. The word that was used here, when I was doing some looking up the word that was used, deeply moved, it actually says there was movement in his soul. Probably literally just in turmoil in his soul. And he went up to the chamber over the gate and he wept. And as he went, he said thus, look how many times he says, my son. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Again, you have to wonder how if Nathan's prophecy of what was going to happen to his sons. He'd seen his firstborn killed. Now Absalom killed. And his grief is inconsolable.
Baby, so does that make
The
more?
baby. Nope. We've got more to come. Yep. And so I wanted for us to continue going on through 19 so that we can get the full story. And in 19 it says, chapter 19, verse 1, and Joab was told, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all of the people. What should have been a parade, and the shofars should have been blown, and there should have been music and dancing in the streets, based on how King David took the news about Absalom, changes. The people heard it For the people heard it said that day, the king is grieved for his son. And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. So we would say with their tails tucked between their legs, they slink back into town because no one is going to be happy on the day when the king is mourning. Verse 4, but the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He's just inconsolable at this point. Then Joab, this is Joab, the one who took the 3 daggers and stuck them into the heart of Absalom. This is Joab who allowed his 10 armor bearers to beat him until he was dead. This is Joab who dug a pit and had stones laid over it in an unmarked grave, did not even bring the body of Absalom back to his father for burial in the family burial tomb. That Joab, cousin of Absalom, nephew of David, came to the house of the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants, who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and your daughters, the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines." Because if Absalom had came into power, what would have happened to David's family? They would have all been killed, right? Remember, that's why Saul's family all fled when David came into power, because they were fearful that they were all going to be killed. So the nurse picks up Mephibosheth and starts to run with him, fearful they were going to kill him, and he falls and he was lame. So he says, these people have saved your lives and saved your family. Verse 6, and that you love your enemies and you hate your friends. So the very people who were trying to kill you, your son Absalom was trying to kill you. He was your declared enemy, out to kill you. Him you grieve. But your friends who put their lives in danger to fight for you, to go out and openly go to war against their fellow brethren in the other tribes, those are the ones you hate. David, you're a mess. You are not handling this situation well at all. For you have declared today that you regard neither prince nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, that would have pleased you well. Do you think he's right? Wait. Do you think he's correct in what he's saying?
Probably.
I think so.
Is there such a thing as excessive grief? Okay. If you're the king and you run a country and you, one of your children are killed in battle, by the way, one of the children who was trying to kill you is killed in battle, is there a certain detachment that needs to occur because of the position that you are in?
Maybe it needs to, but
Again,
how you,
the correct and the right
Yeah.
thing to do, right? What's correct and what's right. Do you remember the story of Aaron?
That's what I was saying.
Yep.
Oh, okay. The story of Aaron,
His sons.
and he was giving the sacrifice, and the strange fire. His sons offered the strange fire, and the Lord killed them. When we went through, when we were in our study of Exodus, we studied about that. And the amazing thing is their bodies burned to a crisp, and their clothes were fine. And and what did God say?
Don't cry.
Don't even shed a tear for your 2 sons that I just killed because of what they did. You continue on leading Israel. You continue on leading the sacrifice. Do not weep for your sons.
Is there a certain I could be totally wrong, but is there a certain honor when your son dies in battle?
Well, not if he's against you, if he's your enemy. Now, perhaps if you're fighting in battle like Jonathan and Saul, and your son dies with you, there's some honor there. The point I'm trying to make, though, in this, and it shouldn't be missed, is that God calls us to a higher calling than anything that we experience here on earth. And it's difficult for us oftentimes, especially today, 21st century. We're not trained that way. We're not taught that way. It's just not in our culture, in our society. We don't have the same mindset. But the mindset of God is always, I am number one on a list of one. And everyone else, whether it be father, mother, sister, brother, husband, wife, or child, is underneath that and takes a secondary position. The New Testament tells us that when Jesus teaches it. There's nothing more important than the relationship. Thank you, Mr. Turkey. There's nothing more important than that relationship. We literally can sin when we allow issues with our family, and I'm preaching to the choir, girls. I'm not throwing anything out there that I haven't experienced myself. We literally sin when we allow that to consume us to the point where our relationship with our Lord is tainted. It does not bring honor and glory to God. Now, the difficult part of that is we love our family members. We love our husband, our wife, our children, all of the family members that are important, grandchildren, and all of that's in our life. And that's right, and it's as it should be. But if at any point the bad behavior of one of those people in our lives conflicts with our relationship with the Lord, I think we need to sit down and evaluate as to whether or not that is bringing glory to God's name. Are we so excessively grieving and immersing ourselves into that we miss the picture of what God has given us to do, which is to be his ambassadors of his kingdom here on earth and bring that news? How easy is it to do, though? I mean, raise your hand. I've done it. We've done it. We've done it. And so it is something that we all struggle with, but it's something that as we mature in our spiritual walk, we come to a realization once we give over to that idea that there is nothing more important than what God has planned for us to accomplish. David's job as the king of Israel was foreordained by God. Back in Deuteronomy, when he talked about when you get a king, here's what will happen and here's what we'll do. The people messed it up when they wanted Saul in there instead, but it was foreordained. And God already knew everything that David was going to do. All the mistakes David was going to make, all of the good things that David was going to do, God already knew. It made no difference. It was God's plan and purpose for him to lead Israel during this time of glory. And God honors him for what it is that he does. Even though he sins so many times, as we are seeing and will continue to see. The problem is that because God had given him that purpose, when David weakens and immerses himself in things like the relationship with Bathsheba, the sexual relationship, an earthly pleasure in that, or this allowing himself not to hold his children accountable for their own actions, because he loved them so much that he would not allow them to grow from what it is that they experienced, and so they become stunted as adults. And they go out and they do horrible things because they didn't grow from that. So the lesson is there for all of us to remember and to recognize God has us here for a higher calling. It's not to go out and spew our political beliefs. It's not to go out and save the earth. It's not to go out and fight for the cause. Those are all good things, all right? I'm not putting any of those down. Those are fine things to do. But that's not our plan and purpose for being here. Our plan and purpose for being here are to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ. And nothing else, none of those things I just mentioned, nor anything you can conjure up in your head can take precedence over that. And if it does, take a step back, pray about it, evaluate where your heart is, and if it's in a wrong place, then repent and vow to move forward in a better spot. Again, I've been right there. So it's how we learn, it's how we grow. And for David, it's how he learns and how he grows. Verse 7, now therefore arise, go out and speak comfort to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And it will be worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth into now. So when he says not one will stay with you, what does he mean? Not even him? Not even any of the people who were fighting with him. What is that noise?
Cute little bird.
A little birdie? So he's being very clear with him. But once again, don't miss this. This is Joab that is coming to him. I killed your son for you. Now come on. Get a grip, David.
Together, yeah.
Pull it together. That's pretty, I mean, in the Jewish world, they would say that's chutzpah. That's gutsy, you know, to go to him after that and say that. But, go ahead.
Does David know, that Joab in fact personally killed his son?
At this point, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure when he finds out exactly that at this point. But he does know that Joab was in charge, at least partially in charge of that, and so could be held accountable even if he had not thrown the darts himself. Even if he had not killed him himself. He was supposed to keep him safe. He was one of the three that had been given the obligation to keep him safe. And so he comes to David and he throws that at him, and then if you look at verse 8, it tells you a little something about what David is learning. He hears counsel and he reacts to it. The worst thing that can happen to people is that as they go along, they refuse to listen to wise counsel because it doesn't meet their needs. That's not what I want to hear. It may be what I need to hear, but I don't want to hear that because it's too hard. It's too hard for me to do that, so I don't want to hear it.
Well,
But-
most likely, David's reaction was just a gut reaction.
Very much
Any of
so.
us would do.
He's a dad, right? He was a father. He was a father, but in the big picture of things, he was the king. That's the big picture. It's hard, but in the big picture, that is what God had planned and purposed for David's life, was to lead Israel. And so the fact that Absalom was fighting that with everything that he had, Absalom had raped people, murdered people, taken in revenge and done all of that. The fact that he had done all of that, he needed to be taken out of the picture. It had been prophesied in chapter 12 that it would be done. And it is what happened. So David hears him. He listens. He doesn't just listen. He hears what he is telling him. And he arose, and he sat in the gate. That would be the place where the king sits, where all the people can see him. It would have been the place where they would have come when they needed to communicate with the king. It would have been like his outdoor throne area where he would have sat. And they told all the people, saying, "There's the king sitting in the gate." So all the people came before the king. And for every one of Israel had fled to his tent. So when they see David sitting where he's supposed to be sitting as the king, recognizing them for what had occurred, recognizing what they had sacrificed for him, it boosts them up, doesn't it? That's exactly what he was to do. It affirms that what they had done was the plan and purpose that they were intended to do. It shows them that the king was happy with what they had done, although personally the news was very sad. And it's what David needed to do, and he does it.
Well, and down through history, the people want to see the king and queen to make sure everything's okay.
Absolutely.
Like in places like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just seeing them in the ones in
Reassures
authority. Had they seen David, falling on his face and throwing a fit,
They would have been insecure in what's happening.
Well, it says they slunk away to their homes, right? They needed that affirmation that what they did was correct. All right, David. So in the end, he comes through. Yay, David. You can turn that off if you don't mind.
David always took advice